بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to lecture 2 in our class on tafsir, continuing with the theme, reading this book by Sheikh Usama al-Azhari on the meta principles of tafsir. The first thing I want to share with you is that the Quran explains itself, and the internal consistency and coherence in the Quran. We'll give a couple of examples of how when you read the Quran, you read like a word or a theme or a concept, and you're interested in that, you want to understand it. You're going to have to go throughout the Quran and find out where that same word, theme, or concept is mentioned, and then those verses will explain one another. The next point or the next principle is the importance of the Sunnah and how the Sunnah explains the Quran and the Quran explains the Sunnah. There's some very beautiful quotes that I'm going to read from you about that highlights it in an important way. The Sunnah being the second type of revelation. Then we are going to look at the importance of usul al-fiqh as a tool for tafsir, which sometimes people forget that usul al-fiqh is what teaches us how to understand the language of the Sharia, the language of the Quran and the Sunnah. Therefore, it's one of the most critical tools in the tafsir because usul al-fiqh teaches us things that other sciences don't teach us in how to understand words and their phrases and their meanings. Next, we are going to look at a principle which is how at a current age, the paradigm of a current age is used to understand the Quran given the parameters of our thinking now, but then our parameters of our thinking tomorrow or in a future generation could expand in certain areas, can contract in certain areas, and how the Quran continually allows us to understand that given the limits of our civilizational understanding. Then we will look at the Quran's effect on our hearts and our souls when we read it. This is a little kind of like a psychological insight about the importance of keeping in mind that the Quran actually impacts the way we understand it and the way we read it. And then lastly, we're going to look at the stories of the prophets, obviously is one of the main themes in the tafsir. So those are the main topics we're going to talk about. It sounds like a lot. Some of them will be a little bit longer than others, but we'll begin inshallah in the next clip. Okay, so the first meta theme is that the Quran explains itself. So the best example is this sequence of verses. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-An'am 82, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يَلْبَسُوا إِيمَانَهُم بِظُلْمٍ. Those who believe and do not confound their faith with injustice. So Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu narrates that when this verse was revealed, the people were distressed and they complained to the Messenger of God, O Messenger of God, which one of us has not wronged himself? So the Prophet answered, it is not as you think. Have you not heard the words of the virtuous servant? And then the Prophet recited Luqman 13, Ya bunayya la tushrik billah inna shirka la dhulmun azim. My son, associate not with God, for association is an immense injustice. So in this example, the Prophet himself is doing tafsir of the Quran with another verse from the Quran, because Ibn Abbas is saying that the other companions felt that was their immediate understanding of that verse, stripped of the context or stripped of how it's related to other verses, is too much to handle. Who amongst us hasn't done injustice to themselves? So the Prophet is saying, no, that's not what injustice here means. It means shirk, as you find in another place in the Quran. And this is very, very common in the Quran. And even when we teach usul al-fiqh, like when we do the waraqat, for example, we use, this is an issue, we use the example of freeing a slave, tahriru raqaba, and in another place, tahriru raqabat al-mu'mina, freeing a believing slave. So the specification of the second verse will then carry to the first verse, and the other verse, which is general, meaning that every time there's an expiation of freeing a slave, the assumption is that it's a believing slave. So it's the same kind of thing, and this is a little bit of a foreshadow to what we talk about in usul al-fiqh. Two quotes I want to read from you. One is from Al-Fakhr al-Razi, in his tafsir, and he says, radiallahu anhu, the Quran is a single surah, or even a single verse, each part of which confirms and clarifies the rest. Do you not see that the verses containing threats are unconditional, yet they are dependent on the verses of repentance and those of forgiveness? So again, none other than Ar-Razi, the great Mufassir, who will, inshallah, in a couple of classes, will jump into his tafsir for a little bit. He's saying that, we treat the Quran as one thing, as one unit. It's all speaking to each other. And to understand one section, you have to look at other sections. And then we have this quote from Sheikh Tahir ibn Ashur, the great Tunisian Maliki scholar, who has a great book on tafsir. He said, "This is not unconditional, for while some parts of the Quran may be interpreted by means of other parts, others are not, since passages which are similar may still carry divergent meanings." So, yes, but sometimes we're not going to find that. Okay, the next thing is about the Sunnah. And we consider the Sunnah to be the second revelation. So the Sunnah is a form of revelation. It's not like some people say, oh, it's just human speech. And yes, it's human speech by way of revelation. Because وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. The Prophet ﷺ does not speak of his own volition, but rather it is a type of revelation. So I want to read you this quote from As-Suyuti's Itqan, quoting Imam al-Shafi'i. So Suyuti says, rahimahullah, Imam al-Shafi'i said, rahimahullah, everything that the community has said is an exegesis of the Sunnah, and the entire Sunnah is an exegesis of the Quran. He also said every judgment given by the Prophet ﷺ originates in what he understood of the Quran. Now I say this is confirmed by his statement ﷺ, I make, meaning the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, I make licit for you only that which God has made licit in his book, and I make illicit only that which God has made illicit in his book. This was transmitted thus by a Shafi'i in Al-Umm. So the Quran and the Hadith are in need of one another for explanation purposes. They speak to one another. And the Sunnah or the Hadith is a form of revelation and is protected. That's why we have all these sciences of verification of the Hadith to arrive at the most sound Hadith. Let me read you another quote from Sheikh Tahir ibn Ashura about this. Is this Tahir ibn Ashur? I think so. He says, a scholar of Usul once asked what the Prophet ﷺ said is all in the Quran, either explicitly or in principle, whether the connection is easy or difficult to grasp. He who is capable of understanding will understand, whereas he who is not will not. The same goes for every judgment he has passed or verdict he gave. The student's grasp of this matter will be in proportion to the effort he expends and to his capabilities and understanding. Sa'id ibn Jubair said, radiallahu anhu, no hadith was ever transmitted to me in a correct manner from the Messenger of God, but that I found confirmation for it in the Book of God. So this is a very important thing, is that you can't do tafsir and engage in the science of tafsir unless you are well grounded in the hadith. And you will find in the hadith the confirmation that's in the Quran, and you will find that the hadith is inspired purely by the Quran. As-Suyuti says in the Itqan, Ibn Abi al-Fadl al-Mursi says in his tafsir, the Quran contains the sciences of the first amongst humans and the last, so that in reality its meaning is known only to him who revealed it, and then to the Messenger of God, apart from which God subhanahu wa ta'ala has kept exclusively for himself. Then the majority of the leading companions inherited this from him, such as the four caliphs, Ibn Mas'ud, Ibn Abbas, who was able to say, Were I to lose the hobble of my camel, I would be able to find it through the book of God. The quote we mentioned in yesterday's lecture. Then those who followed with excellence inherited it from them, but then resolution faltered, knowledge receded, and scholars became too feeble to continue carrying what the companions and the followers had carried of its sciences and various arts. So they separated them into distinct specialities, and each group took charge of a single speciality. So this is kind of like what we mentioned yesterday, that a lot of what we're talking about was naturally and instinctively part of the early generation, but then they had to be sort of codified, the different sciences, the sunnah being one of them. So there's a lot of tafsir only by the sunnah, tafsir bil ma'thur. We're going to look at Ibn Kathir as an example. Of course, one of the most famous examples also is the Suyuti's Ad-Durr al-Manthur, Ad-Durr al-Manthur, Ad-Durr al-Manthur في التفسير بالمأثور, which is also, this is a verse and all of the hadith about this verse, and that's what Ibn Kathir does. So we're going to look at that as an example. So that's a genre, right? That's a type of hadith. Tafsir is the tafsir bil ma'thur, doing the tafsir by the hadith traditions. Another benefit of this approach to the tafsir is that it becomes a catalog of earlier documented traditions. And the reason that that's important, and that the reason that tafsirs tend to be very long, is that they contain just a lot of information. Now, sometimes people will be like, oh, that's overwhelming and that's too much and redundant. But the reality is that we are a tradition, we are a people of retention. We retain things, even things that are false and weak and whatnot, because we don't know that a particular thing that we retain might have benefit for those that will come after us. So to this, he quotes, this is a quote from Abdul Qadir ibn al-Badran in his Madkhal. They were recorded for other reasons, which is to attract attention to the possible range of diversity in the rulings, the variety of intellectual capacities and styles, and that these were the opinions of independent scholars at one time. This is of help in reaching the rank of unconditional or conditional independence. When the latecomers study and compare the work of their predecessors, they will extract instructive benefits. The sum of these may tilt the balance towards a particular opinion. This is important and is the main benefit drawn from recording the opinions of the leading scholars of old. And we'll pick up the discussion, inshallah, in the next clip. So just a quick summary of that last point, because I ended with a quote, is the sunnah is a major theme and principle in our approach to tafsir, and therefore there is a genre of tafsir that's called the tafsir bil ma'thur, the tafsir by traditions, and it tends to be encyclopedic, because in that type of tafsir we just stuff in all of the traditions about something. So even like in the Suyuti's tafsir, Ad-Durr al-Manthur, you'll find many weak traditions. So, and sometimes a modern person will not understand that and will think that that was a mistake, or it's not a mistake. The point of a tafsir bil ma'thur is to document all the things that we have in the traditions about this verse or sequence of verses of story. That doesn't mean that all of them are valid. That's not the point. The point here is not to do it at tafsir bil sahih, for example, or something. No, say bil ma'thur, everything that has been narrated, whatever that, even if it's spurious. And then, why do we do that? When we read that quote by Abdul Qadir ibn Badran in his Madkhal, is it tells you there's going to be benefit. Somebody in the future is going to benefit from that. They're going to read it and be like, oh my God, look, we found this tradition. Okay, there's some weakness in it, but we can use this for such and such solution, such and such issue. So that's very, very important and significant. And related to this, its twin is, the modern disease of attacking the weak hadith as if it's something that's bad, which we talked about in our hadith class, and it's not appropriate to get in now. Okay, the next principle is the importance of usul al-fiqh. And of course, you guys have been studying with me now, so you know the importance that I place on usul al-fiqh as well, because that was my training. But usul al-fiqh, as we learned when we studied usul al-fiqh, means usus al-fahm. It means the basis of how we understand. So this is our epistemological tradition, is answered like, what is our epistemology? What is our tradition of interpretation? The answer is found in Usul al-Fiqh. It teaches us how to understand what it is that we are reading in the Quran and the Sunnah. That's the meaning of Usul al-Fiqh at its most basic, linguistic level. So as Subki says, and in the last class I didn't realize that the benefit of the English translation is that all of these important quotes are translated. I was like, duh, of course they're translated. That's why it's a translation. So I switched to this today so I can read to you these quotes, because these are quotes from the greats. You don't have to take my word for it. So Subki says in his Ibhaj, his commentary on the in Usul al-Fiqh, Al-Ibhaj fi Sharh al-Minhaj. So he says, rahimahullah, the Usulis, here he means Usul al-Fiqh, the Usulis have reached certain things in the Arabic language that neither the linguists nor the grammarians had ever fathomed before, for the language of the Arabs is quite vast and branches into numerous areas of study. Thus, the book of linguistics are concerned with defining expressions according to their obvious meanings, not such subtle meanings as the Usulis' attention and deeper probing than that of the linguist. For example, do, if'al, is a command, while la taf'al, don't do, is a prohibition. Every, kul, and what resembles it are for generalizations and so on. All the things that we studied in Usul al-Fiqh. When you reach the books of the linguistics, you find no satisfaction there, not to mention of what the Usulis have said about it. The same applies to the books of grammar, for they do not contain many of the subtleties that the Usulis have concentrated on and deduced from the language of the Arabs. The latter have come up with arguments and rules of their own that are not included in the art of grammar proper. Thus, this and other similar things are what the science of the principles of jurisprudence has accomplished. So the reason we have this quote about language is that the main, like the first third of Usul al-Fiqh, or the first fourth of it, is just a query into expressions and understanding and meanings of words and linguistic constructs. And what Subki is saying, and all of the other Usulis, is that when it comes to language, for example, the Usulis talk about language in a way that not even the grammarians talk about. When it comes to theological matters, the Usulis talk about theology in a way that not even the theologians talk about. When it comes to philosophy, the Usulis talk about philosophical matters in a way that not even the Usulis talk about, philosophers talk about, so on and so forth. And this is one of the ways that we demonstrate when we teach Usul al-Fiqh, by the way, that Usul al-Fiqh is its own standalone science. It's not just simply a cut and paste of different sciences put together. We call it Usul al-Fiqh. No, because the mabahith, the areas of research in these subjects in Usul al-Fiqh are unique to Usul al-Fiqh. So therefore, because Usul al-Fiqh is so obsessed with understanding the language of the revelation, how could it not be a tool of the Mufassir? Well, it has to be, because the Mufassir needs to understand what is meant from these words, what is meant from these phrases in the Quran. I need to pick up the speed a little bit, but let me read this quote by Al-Ghazali, because it's just so good. This is from his Mustasfa in Usul al-Fiqh. He says, rahimahullah, it is the foundation of the science of principles, for the field of the mujtahid is striving to deduce judgments from their principles and pluck them from their branches. For neither do the judgments in themselves depend on the personal choice of the mujtahid, nor was the establishment of the four principles that are the kitab, the book, the sunnah, consensus, and qiyas, a human choice. The range wherein the mujtahid moves and is responsible in his use of his rational powers in extracting judgments and deducing them from their sources, which are transmitted evidence. So therefore, the Usul al-Fiqh becomes an important tool for the Mufassir. Okay, I'm going to skip next to the next chapter, just in the interest of time. Let me read you the translation of this chapter. It's not the best translation, but the need for the exegete to keep up with the amplifications and the meaning of verbal expressions that accompany the expansion of the limits of knowledge of a given civilization and the cumulative effects of its experiences, which maybe says a whole lot about nothing, but the translation is not so it's too clunky of a term. This is, I think, an area where a literal translation doesn't work. But basically, what this principle is about is that at every age, we use language in a certain way. So when we say certain words, we mean certain things. If you looked 100 years ago, The same language that I'm using now, even the English language, might have not been entirely understood by the people 100 years ago, and vice versa, we would have understood them because they use certain words in a different way. And this is a huge stumbling block for many historians, for example, that are trying to go back and write about a piece of history by bringing today's bias to the past. It's a very common problem of historians, and it renders, it kind of pollutes the whole historical narrative that the person is trying to put together. I'm just giving you an example. We'll come back to the tafsir, because I can't understand the past with how I understand today. I have to go back and see how are they thinking about it, what were the words, what did words mean, concepts mean, so I can correctly place a judgment on them. Remember, when we talked about logic, we talked about tasawurat and tasdiqat. You have to conceptualize and then have a judgment. It's the same kind of idea. So when it comes to tafsir, the Quran is speaking outside of place and time and people and circumstance because it's mutlaq, it's an absolute text, it's a piece of revelation, of course, the final revelation. Therefore, it's going to have to hit at each age, at each people, in a way that they can understand it, which means that the mufassir's job is to explain it in the language of today, which means that tafsir is going to be like a never-ending process. It's just going to keep going because every age, every generation, there are going to be new kind of things. Let me give you an example. Like citizenship is a modern world, a modern word, that's a function of the nation state, the republican system of government, so on and so forth, representative government, all of that. That's just like in the age of human history, that's like the day before yesterday. But at the time of the revelation, there was a concept of citizenship with the Constitution of Medina, even the word Constitution of Medina. It's a new word, but when I say that, citizenship, constitution, rule of law, what we mean by that today, we can go back then and see that's exactly what that was, a manifestation of that in the past. That's an example. So that's very, very important for the mufassir to take into consideration because you want to make sure that you are drawing the right types of meaning. So Ibn Ashur says to this effect. Well, first of all, Mustafa As-Sadiq Al-Rafi'i, one of the great linguists of the last century, he says in Tarikh Adab Al-Arabi, the history of Arabic literature, he has the sentence, the Quran is a verbal presence that is designed to perpetually remain with mankind. So that means you have to understand it. And then this quote by Tahir Ibn Ashur. The second kind of scientific matchlessness is divided into two sections. One where it suffices to hear and understand, and another which needs acquaintance with the foundation of various sciences to grasp its miraculousness, so that it gradually becomes clearer, just as the day gradually becomes clearer at dawn, according to the limits of understanding and the development of the various sciences. I'll pick up the discussion in the next and final clip, inshallah. So that last quote I read by Tahir ibn Ashur, rahimahullah, is that some things we're going to understand, like punishment and reward, repentance, tawheed, we're going to understand. But there are other things which need to be understood in the language of where the thought, the maximum, of where the ceiling or where the thought paradigm is today, so that we can make sense of it. And that's why the tafsir project is going to be a never-ending project. It's just going to keep going. But nobody can speak in a way that speaks for all time and place and people and circumstance. I mean, the prophets could, but they're infallible and they have, revelation. But after that, we can't do that. So even if I gave a great speech or I summarize something now, over time, it might lose its meaning, or it might get lost, or the significance of it might get lost, etc., with very rare exceptions. The Quran is not like that. The Quran is for all places and time and people and circumstance and so on and so forth. So therefore, one of the jobs of the tafsir, or one of the principles of the mufassir, is to constantly keep that into consideration and explain this sequence of verses, for example, about the story of Musa alayhi salam and Fir'aun. Like, what does that mean given how we talk about things today? That's what we're talking about. So to do that, the mufassir then needs to know how people think today. how people think. When I say citizenship today, what does that mean? We have to understand the waqa. We have to understand the current context in which we live just as well, and to be just as fluent in it as we need to be fluent in all of the Sharia sciences to be able to go to the tafsir. So it's a great, that's why I said at the beginning, it's a big thing. The tafsir is a big deal. It's kind of like the be all and end all, because you kind of have to, it wraps up everything that we're trying to teach and learn ourselves. So for me to be able to communicate the meanings of the Quran effectively, given the ceiling of where people are thinking today and the idioms and the concepts that we have today, I have to be able to know that as well, and then go back to the Quran and know the Quran and link the two together. Okay, another principle is the psychological principle, the effect that the Quran has on us as we read it. And this is a very kind of, this is a specialty that very few people pay attention to, because it requires a deep understanding of the rhetoric and the balagha of the Quran. This is a quote from Imam al-Khattabi in his Bayan A'jaz al-Quran. He says, rahimahullah, the matchlessness of the Quran has another aspect that most people are unaware of, so much so that only rare individuals are aware of it, which is its effects on the hearts and influence on the soul. There is no poetry or prose other than the Quran, which, when heard, arouses in the heart such sweetness and pleasure at times and awe and fear at others. It is able to bring joy and optimism into the heart and expand the breast, and then it changes into fear, dread, apprehension, and terror. It causes the skins to shiver and the hearts to panic, and penetrates between the souls and their innermost thoughts and firmest beliefs. It's a very beautiful quote. So, this is the a'jaz, the matchlessness of the Quran, the miracle of the language of the Quran is in its language and in its use of language. And this is something that not necessarily, but usually gets lost in translation. I mean, if you believe in the metaphysics behind language, and that language has the same origin, and that's what our belief, the majority school of usul al-fiqh, is that language is established. Therefore, from a metaphysical point of view, you should be able to replicate that, or not exactly replicate that. You should be able to communicate that in the English language, or French, or German, or Swahili, or whatever. But that's very hard, because most people don't know their own native language that well either. So this is something where Arabic becomes very, very important. And the balagha, the rhetoric of the Quran, and the way that the Quran brings up things is very, very important. Let me read you this quote by al-Baqillani in his A'jaz al-Quran. It suffices the sense about the Quran. It suffices the senses, flows through the veins, and fills one with certainty and insight. I mean, it's such a beautiful sentence. He then describes how terror comes over one from one side, even while he is swayed by delight from another, then entirely soothes yet from another. He asks whether you can see how the ignorant fall down under the feet of heedlessness, where they plummet under the shadows of indigence and abasement. Do you see their worth with the eye it should be seen with, their degrees where they should be? He goes on describing the effects of the Quran on the heart in a most powerfully poetic style, then adds that its central importance is rendered evident by the fact that, quote, so this is the long quote now, it has made the basis of the ritual prayer, which ranks only after faith itself in importance and second only to tawheed and necessity, that to memorize it was made incumbent, and that the young and the old are enjoined to recite it. Furthermore, as is decreed in Allah's words, and when you recite the Quran, seek protection in God from the reputed devil, it should be magnified even before its recitation is begun. There is no order to seek protection from initiating any act save reciting the Quran. Does not that indicate to you how great its rank is, how heavy on the scale and lofty in position it is? So, when you get into some of that is lost in translation, I think, but when you get into it, that it becomes this very powerful medium, and its communication has a visceral effect on people. So the most important thing after Tawheed is our prayer, And to begin with the prayer, you have to recite the Fatiha, and to begin the Fatiha, we recite A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajim, to show you the importance of it to be, in a state in which you are prepared. This is where psychology and tasawwuf are going to play a big role in understanding the impacts of the Quran. And then the last principle is the principle of the stories of the prophets. Now, every time I talk about the stories of the prophets, I always invoke Joseph Campbell's A Hero with a Thousand Faces, who is, for the last generation, one of the most impactful ideas of the hero's journey. And one of the greatest manifestations of that is George Lucas and the Star Wars Enterprise, which, Joseph Campbell's writing was one of the most impactful books on George Lucas and many others of that generation to write about the hero's journey. It's beautiful. Joseph Campbell's very entertaining to read, even more entertaining to listen to if you find video clips of him. But the prophets are not heroes. They are beyond that because they are infallible. And many Muslims, maybe unbeknownst to them or subconsciously, make the mistake of assuming that the prophets are like these heroes. Oh, he's my hero. No, they are archetypes. They are infallible. From the moment they were born to the moment that they die, they are protected, they receive revelation. Heroes don't receive it. Heroes start out here, there's an arc and, end up here. Yeah, okay, that could be any of us. A saintly person can be a hero, but not the Anbiya. The awliya, yes, but not the Anbiya. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen in the Quran to give us some of the stories of the prophets, not all of the stories of the prophets. Why? Well, therefore, that's the first query. That must be, therefore, that these are so axiomatic, they kind of subsume all of the other stories. So one of the principles of the stories of using Qisas al-Anbiya, the stories of the prophets in tafsir, is to see in those stories the macro meanings that we need to understand. So Shaykh Osama uses the story of Sayyidina Shu'aib alayhi salam and says that Shu'aib's people summarize or their issue was the issue of secularism. Because they said, O Shu'aib, does your prayer command you that we should abandon what our fathers have worshipped, or that we dispose of our wealth as we wish? You have always been an intelligent and wise man. So Shaykh Osama says, in addition to their disbelief, the people of Shu'aib had another problem, which was that they recognized no connection between piety, prayer, and virtue on the one hand, and their financial affairs on the other, believing that there was no relation between religious and economic affairs. This is why they found it strange that he thought there should be. Thus does the story of Shu'aib contain a Quranic discussion on the question of secularism and a refutation of its arguments. It makes clear its harm and suggests the alternative, namely the divine teachings concerning the subject. So therefore, one of the principles, let me just wrap it up, is to look at the tafsir, the stories of the Anbiya in that way, as axiomatic of a bigger concept, and therefore what are the lessons in addition to the specifics of the story, which is also going to be part of the tafsir. Those are the main topics I want to discuss today. We'll put a pin in it here. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Okay, alhamdulillah, we made a huge dent in today's lecture. So let me go back for the recap. We talked about some of the major principles of the Quran, starting with that the Quran explains itself. At-Tafsir al-Qur'ani bil-Quran. So we find one verse about a topic we're interested in, doing tafsir of, then we need to find out where that word or that concept is throughout the whole Quran. Put them all together to derive important meanings. And this is what we usually call a thematic tafsir of the Quran, and one of the most popular of the modern age was that by Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali. I just happen to have a copy here next to me, which is translated into English. It's a thick one, but this is a kind of a modern example of exactly that. Kind of what's the general theme about this issue. Next, we talked about the importance of the Sunnah, and that the Sunnah is a part of revelation, of course, without dispute. It's one of the two forms of revelation. And therefore, the Sunnah explains the Quran explains the Sunnah. There isn't a hadith except that it is coming and emanating from one of the sections or verses of the Quran. And we had some beautiful supporting quotes on that from As-Suyuti's Itqan. Then we looked at the importance of Usul al-Fiqh, and since Usul al-Fiqh teaches us how to understand expressions and meanings of the language of the Sharia, the Quran and the Sunnah, therefore it's got to be one of the critical tools of the Mufassir, most especially because you will find the linguistic research, points of research in Usul al-Fiqh are deeper and completely different than the linguists themselves because they are looking at it from a different vantage point. Then we looked at the importance of the paradigms and the ceiling of what we understand today and having to be able to communicate the Quran in a way that people can understand, therefore tafsir being a never-ending process. Then we looked at the impact that the Quran has when we read it, our souls, the psychological change that happens when we read the Quran and how that's really stemming from a lot of it from the Arabic language. And then lastly, we looked at the importance of the stories of the prophets and how we look at them in an axiomatic way, not just their specifics, but in addition to the specifics, an axiomatic way. We gave the example of the story of Sayyidina Shu'aib alayhi salam. Those are the main topics we talked about today, and that's it for today. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.